Hey guys, how's everybody doing? This is Nick with Urban Farm Boys, and I'm going to do something today that I haven't done in years, which is a book review. If you've been following my channel for a long time, I've focused on all sorts of different topics in this channel over the years. And one thing I used to do fairly frequently, a long time ago, was book reviews. I used to talk about what I was reading all the time. It's been 10 years maybe since I made my last book review video. I've been making YouTube videos since 2006, so it's been a minute. But I just finished a book and I have to talk about it with you guys. So the book that I just finished and I wanted to talk about is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. I am 9 years late in reading this book, and I knew nothing about it until a couple of weeks ago. And so there's tons and tons of people who are reviewing books on YouTube. Tons of people have talked about this one. But not everybody has read it, because I just heard about it, and my partner Andrew just heard about it recently too. So this might be the first time you're hearing about it, or maybe not, and maybe you just want to hear other people's perspectives. I just finished this morning. I stayed awake. I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking about the book, had to finish it, and I read it furiously until 9 this morning. And then I've been thinking about it all day, and I've been watching reviews of other people who have shared their opinions, so I wanted to share some opinions today. So if you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm not typically a book reviewer. If you are a member of the channel, I'm going to talk about a book for a little bit, so I hope that's okay. My channel has had a lot of different iterations over the years. I basically these days make videos about things that interest me, and I hope that people follow along. These days a lot of my videos are related to homesteading, plants. I do a lot of videos about crochet lately, all sorts of different things. But I've got to talk about this book today. Where do you even begin? What I would like to do is talk briefly about the synopsis of the book, and then give some opinions of mine. I'm going to have the beginning of this little portion be sort of spoiler-free in case, like me, you haven't read it or heard of it before. I'll warn you guys when the spoiler section is coming. Yeah, there's just so many things to say about this book. I should probably start by saying that I am not a book reviewer. I'm not a critic. I'm not... This, book reviews and analysis and all of that is outside of my realm. And I know that people are very passionate about their books, especially on things like YouTube and TikTok and all of that. I follow several sort of booktubers, and people have very, very strong opinions about books. Listen, I just wanted to talk about a book that made me think a lot and feel a lot of things, and not everybody has to agree with me. I watched a bunch of reviews this morning after finishing the book and found that people have very strong opinions about this book across the spectrum of emotions. So I try not to be too controversial on this channel. I'm just going to share some of my thoughts and observations, and you don't have to agree with me. I love this book. Still digesting. I just finished it a few hours ago. But I think this might be one of my favorite books I've ever read. It's probably the book that has elicited the biggest emotional response in me that I've ever read. And I think it's great. I really do. The hot take that I have, as the title of the video suggests, is I think this might be one of the most beautiful love stories that I've ever read. I don't know if a whole lot of people see it that way, but it took me 400-500 pages of this book before I started seeing it that way, and then I couldn't see it as anything more than a really beautiful love story amongst several people in several different ways. This book is essentially a story about friends. It's about 4 friends, primarily. You have Jude, Willem, JB, and Malcolm. And they're friends. We sort of meet them when they're in college. We get flashbacks through sort of all of their childhoods, but essentially we meet them in college and we follow them throughout their life. This is very much sort of a New York story. It takes place primarily in New York City, which is fun for me because I used to live in Manhattan, where the story takes place primarily. And I still live in New York. I'm just a little bit outside of the city now. And so it's a city of 4 guys sort of meeting and making themselves in New York City. Along the way, you meet several other characters. It's not a huge cast of characters. There's maybe 6 or 7 primary characters. But fairly early on into the book, we find that there's one sort of primary character, and that is Jude, who I would like to believe is portrayed here on the cover. Jude St. Francis becomes kind of the primary character, and we really, in the book, learn that this whole story revolves around him, his present, his past, and his life as it's told throughout the book. Because there are so many reviews, and because this book is not new and so many people have read it, I don't want to go into like a detailed breakdown of the story. I wanted to talk more about my opinions about the book. But what we find here is basically a story of these friends and the people around them, and they all sort of revolve or orbit around this main character, Jude, who is smart and sort of mysterious and very closed and careful. And everyone knows that he has a history and a background that he is not interested in discussing. And they know that it's bad. He's got sort of emotional baggage from it. He's got physical manifestations of this very traumatic past that he has. And it's essentially about him moving through his life, coping with his past as his friends remain his friend, which is sometimes easier than others, not ever really knowing what his story is. And it's really that. It's kind of like a slice of life. You're peering into these people's lives. Through actually, I mean, in Jude's case, it's sort of his entire life story in here with, the majority of the life of the other people in the book. There's all sorts of things I've read about this book that people, like to refer to it as. People say, this is the saddest book you'll ever read, or the most traumatic book you'll ever read. People have used terms like trauma porn, torture porn. People seem to say this book is just super, super, super sad and super, super traumatic and really, really, really bad. And if you want to just cry for 800 pages, you should read this book. Just as a little bit of my background, I have grown up my entire life loving horror movies and horror books. And as I'm older, I'm nearly 40 years old now, I really do enjoy a lot of scary movies and books. And my sort of affinity for that genre creeps pretty far into the extreme. So I like all sorts of scary movies, even things that are pretty messed up. If you're a horror movie aficionado, I would say 2 movies, or maybe 3, let's call it 3, that are pretty extreme maybe, or people call extreme, that I really sort of enjoy. Martyrs, the original French one, which may be the most traumatizing movie I've ever seen. Salo, or 120 Days of Sodom, and a Serbian film. Those are 3 movies that come up frequently at the top lists of sort of most disturbing movies. And I actually really appreciate all of them in different ways and for what they are. I don't really ever want to watch Martyrs again, necessarily. That movie stuck with me for a long time. But I appreciate what they were trying to convey in all of those movies. And the same goes for books. I like messed up horror fiction. I have to look at my reading list. So just some books that people say are fairly messed up and cross boundaries into like things people call like splatter punk and like extreme horror and all of that, but that I sort of have enjoyed in one way or another. The book Cows by Matthew Stokoe. Aaron Beauregard, I read The Playground, which was entertaining. I couldn't stand the way he writes, but I found the story to be entertaining. And Exquisite Corpse by William Joseph Martin. Another fairly disturbing book that I also thought was really beautiful. So if you read books like that or watch movies like that, I can handle pretty dark and intense topics and also enjoy them. So when people said like this is torture porn, trauma porn, I was ready for something really, really dark and twisty, like especially some of those books or the movie Martyrs. It's not what I found. This book is beautifully tragic. It's the beautifully tragic story of one person and all of the people who surround him. And there are a lot of heavy parts to this. So people post trigger warnings about what can be found in this book. There's a lot of them. You know, it has to do with things like physical abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, pedophilia, eating disorders, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and more. There's a lot. I found, though, that nothing, if you know any of the books I just mentioned, nothing in this book is as extreme as literally the books I just mentioned. What this book has that those books don't, in my opinion, is that you develop this strong emotional bond with the characters, with virtually all of the characters. And so the difficult topics or scenes, and there are many, many, are difficult. They're not graphic, again, comparing to some of the other things I've read, but I think there's a point and a purpose. None of it is, what's the word I'm looking for, like just gratuitous. Like, let's talk about Playground by Aaron Beauregard. By the way, if you don't like super duper extreme books, don't even Google that book or the author. That whole book is about, like, let's get a reaction from people by creating the most extreme things we can come up with. Zola, guys, do you know Zola? This is not that. This is a really beautiful story. It's big, it's long, it's over 800 pages long, and I would say the first 300 to 400 pages are really about character development. It's about getting to know these 4 guys and the people around them. And within those 400 pages, you learn a fair bit about Jude and who he is and his past, and much of it is traumatic. We know from his present that his past was traumatic. But I would say the first nearly half of the book, maybe the first 300 pages, build relationships between the people in this book and you, the reader. You become very attached to them. They become very real. And then I would say the last half of the book just sort of derails everything. You become more and more attached until the very last page, but it's not an easy read. It's not an easy read. It is as sad and traumatic as everyone says it is, until the very end. You can look on TikTok, you can look on YouTube, you can watch tons and tons of people crying while reading this book. I think that's what I learned first about this book, was read this book and you'll cry. I'm not a crier, really. I'm not super emotional in those sorts of ways. 7 times I cried during this book. One time I shed a few tears, maybe 200 or 300 pages in. And in the last 100 pages, which I read maybe 200 pages this morning, but the last third of this book, I cried 6 times. And then I got teary every time I would think about it, and that was only a few hours ago. It's very, very touching and very emotional. And so, what did I think about it? Did I like it? Did I hate it? I really, really enjoyed this book. I think it'll take some time to process, but I really, really liked it a lot. I think it's one of my favorite books that I've ever read. I'm going to read it again. I just need to take a break and do some other things for a year or 2 before I dive in again. But it was really good. And so here's my takeaway. Here's what I think that maybe other people don't take away from this book. I think this might be the most beautiful, tragic love story that I've ever read. And it took me about 400 or so pages before I started to see it as a love story. It's a love story. It's a few love stories. I'm not going to get into the spoilers yet. I'll warn you before I do. But this book, it's actually not boring ever, really. I really enjoyed all of it, but it really does have this strong build-up where the characters just become people that you feel like you know. And then this love story just becomes so deep. A few love stories. And as I got closer and closer to the edge, I think to the end, I thought I just got more emotional because it became more and more of a love story the further I got to the end of the story. And the stronger that love story or those love stories became. Doesn't it mean it's a happy love story? I don't think anyone has ever said this is a happy love story. It's a tragedy for sure. But this book was just so intensely beautiful about the relationships between people that are maybe stronger relationships than I've ever read about or seen. I don't know if I've ever cried from a book before. I really don't cry from movies, mostly if it involves animals dying, especially if they're like cute dogs. No, and I can handle dark and twisty for sure, and I enjoy dark and twisty. This went from something I thought was going to be dark and twisty to something that I thought was so beautiful that when things went wrong, it just really, really impacted me. A dark, a serious, beautiful love story. And maybe more than a love story, a story of one person that is traumatic and flawed and imperfect and inspiring and beautiful And that does not have a happy ending. I don't think that's a spoiler. None of us expect this book to have a happy ending. But I really thought it was great. I thought it was a great, great book. And more than anything, my takeaway was, what a beautiful love story. Flawed, imperfect, traumatic, and yet something that I'm like, wow. The very last part of this little review, there may be some gentle spoilers. I'm not going to give... I'll put a spoiler alert. This book was published 9 years ago. I'm not going to tell the story or ruin everything. But if you don't want to hear what I'm going to say, I may ruin a few things. So your spoiler warning starts now. After I finished this, I watched a lot of reviews on YouTube, and I started with some of the most popular reviews of this book. A lot of them are good. A lot of people love this book. A lot of people hate this book. I'm going to talk about one video that I saw, which was a review of a very popular review from someone who hated this book. And I don't really need to name names, and I don't like drama in my channel, but I appreciated that person's review because it really made me think about the book and sort of solidify my own feelings. The review that I saw was from a person who I don't know. I've never seen their videos before. They were a person of color, a person who seems to be a female. I don't know about their gender identity or sexuality. They did indicate that they have a very close family member who has had what they call a disability, and they definitely do not identify as a gay male or bisexual male. So this book, it's about 4 guys. There's a lot of discussion about sexuality in this book, and there's a lot of sort of fluidity there in sexuality world. And the person who didn't like this book really made me think, because they had some surely very valid concerns about topics of sexuality, of race, of disability, and how that's perceived, about sort of suicidal ideation and how people deal with trauma, and about all of the relationships. And this person had a lot of critiques because she didn't like how the characters behaved. I think maybe that was my overall understanding of the review, was she didn't like a lot of the things that the characters did. I'm not criticizing this book reviewer, and most all of her points are very valid. Listening to her review, and I agree with some of it and I disagree with some of it, and she might be able to relate on a personal level to certain aspects, and I might be able to relate to other aspects, and neither of us can relate to many aspects, right? We both read a book and we have opinions. I didn't like everyone in this book either, for sure. Not the secondary characters, not the primary characters at times, and even the protagonist, who I believe to be Jude. I had a hard time with Jude. Many times I wanted him to be different than he was, say different things, make different choices. And the same goes for almost everyone in this book. The critiques I watched on YouTube about this book seemed to mostly be about people who didn't like the choices that the characters made. Their beliefs, their choices, their words, their actions, etc. And here's my takeaway. This is a great story about a bunch of sort of deeply flawed people over the course of their lifetimes. And sometimes they say things and do things, or don't say things or don't do things that we don't like. I think that makes a really great book because it makes me have strong opinions about them. So many of the reviews that I read were people saying, I don't like when they did this. I don't like how they said that. I don't like how maybe the author portrayed this thing from that person's perspective. Me neither. I don't want to read the book where the whole book is about all the things that I like and believe and think and approve of. So that was sort of something interesting when I looked at other people reviewing this book, was so much of it seemed to be, I don't like how they portray, I'll give you some examples. I don't like how they portray disabled people, or their own, as disabled people, their own perceived weakness or inability to overcome. Well, I don't either, but I believe that there may be a person out there who feels that way, or if not, then this is a fictional story. Or I don't like the sexuality of the characters because I don't understand it. Okay, that is a fairly central concept in this book. I don't like that. Well, no, they don't exactly fit into some of the standardized boxes that we have these days, even if we have more boxes today than we did, yesterday, right? But this book might not fit into the boxes that some of us understand. That doesn't mean I don't like the characters or that I don't believe that there are people going through things like this. Or I don't like the way mental health is perceived. I heard some talk about the victim always believing they're a victim. And someone said they didn't like that you don't always have to be a victim, and you can overcome, and you can do better. And they said it was exhausting and this book was too long because it was too much of like the victim playing the victim, and they almost seemed angry at the author for doing that to the victim, like let them get better. Or I don't know if I even like that terminology, but like they're not just a victim, they're more than just a victim, and the author made them just be a victim. And yes, I agree, that sounds good, but I also believe some people don't get past their past. And if there's no such person in the world, then this is a fictional story of someone who didn't get past their past. I don't know, I really thought that most of the critiques of this book were about people who didn't like the choices of the characters or the choices of the author, and I think that's the point. I didn't either, which is why I had emotional reactions to the story. I don't want to read a book where everyone is the same as me, and this challenged all of that. You can't see over here, I have my rainbow flag waving. I am in a same-sex relationship. I have been an LGBT person my entire life. There's a lot of LGBT concepts in this book that are interesting to me and confusing in some ways, and they were written about male sexuality from a female author. I don't know about her sexuality. I'm not mad and saying, well, she doesn't get to write about the gay or bisexual male experience because she hasn't lived that. She wrote an interesting story, one that I call maybe the most beautiful love story I've ever read. So I think that's my takeaway. I'm not going to give any more spoilers, and if you want to learn all about the book, you can read or watch as much as you want online. There's a ton of reviews. I think it's fantastic and disturbing and beautiful. Is it extreme? Who can handle it? Let's talk for my last little thought here. And again, I'm not a book reviewer, I'm not a critic. I have a few opinions, they're mine, and if you don't agree, that's very okay too. I would love to continue this conversation in the comments. Let's all just keep it respectful. But I'll say something now on the eve of my 40th birthday. My 40th birthday is in 2 weeks. Which makes me, depending on who you ask, I'm either a very young Gen Xer, or what do they call it, an elder millennial. I definitely think I connect more with Gen Z than the millennial era. I was born in 84, so some people say 80 is the cusp, some people say 85 is the cusp, I don't know. But I'm almost 40. Trigger warnings. So I'll just give a little brief personal opinion about trigger warnings. I don't understand these days why everyone has to feel that they need to provide trigger warnings, bleep certain words, give little asterisks in the place of vowels when they write certain words. I think the idea is trying to protect people who are sensitive from certain topics, I guess. I didn't grow up with something like that, and while I appreciate the intent, I think we all live in the real world, and you can't protect everyone from everything, and I don't expect to be protected by anyone, and so I don't really do that either. This book, I think it's fair to warn people what they're in for, because this is a fairly serious book in mainstream world. It's got a lot of very heavy topics, and maybe not everybody wants to read about all of those things. But I think if that's you and you have certain things you don't want to be exposed to, it's up to me, you, all of us to do our own work. If you're going to buy a book and you're worried about those things because you don't want to experience them, maybe do a little research first. I don't know. The trigger warning thing is something that I will never really do. YouTube doesn't like bad words and certain words, so because my channel is monetized, from time to time I do bleep certain words, very rarely, and I make an active effort not to swear on my channel because I don't want to go back and bleep that later. And the only reason I do that is for monetization purposes. That's a monetary decision, not because I don't think people can handle hearing the word f***. I would like to live in a world where there's no censorship, but YouTube is not that world. This book is extreme, like I said, in maybe mainstream media. There's a lot more serious and more dark and more messed up you can find. Again, refer back to a few of the books I mentioned and so many more. So this book was not, to me, that messed up. Terms like trauma porn and torture porn I don't think apply to this book at all whatsoever. And if you want books like that, trust me, they exist. Movies, all of that. This was a traumatic love story. And if there are topics in it that you cannot handle being exposed to, don't read it. I think maybe the majority of people who watch reviews about this book would like to, or they're at least curious about it. So do your due diligence and see what is in the book and whether it's something you can handle. I don't have kids. A lot of the things that happen in this book are happening to children. My perspective may or may not change when I have kids. I understand that that's probably much more difficult if you are a parent. So, to each their own. So, trigger warning for everything. This is a hard book. I don't demand trigger warnings before consuming any sort of media. If you do, no problem. This probably has most of the trigger warnings. So, use your own judgment. There are much happier books that you could read that are much better for your mental health. You want to read a really challenging love story? I think I really love this book. If you've noticed, there's a little piece of yarn sticking out in this book. Andrew has been reading the print version. I downloaded the audiobook. So this little piece of yarn that he stole from one of my crochet projects is his bookmark. And he's on page 179, which is midway through part 2. The book is divided into, I think, 7 parts. He's midway into part 2. And I'm like, oh buddy, the innocence before it gets so much worse. But anyway, I love this book. I don't usually do book reviews. I would love to hear you guys' opinions. Good, bad, everything in between. Let's be respectful downstairs in the comments, but if you've read it, share your thoughts. Maybe just put spoiler alert at the beginning of your comment if you're gonna write about spoilers. It's old enough that I feel like we shouldn't have to, but I didn't know about this book until a month ago, so a lot of people probably also don't. So let's chat down below. And I'd love to hear from people who don't like it. And maybe we'll chat in the comments. I'll tell you more about my thoughts in the comments. If you really didn't like this book, tell me why. We'll talk about it. If you did, let's also talk about it. This book is going to stick with me for a really long time. So I hope you guys enjoyed. If you are one of my normal subscribers, thanks for sitting through a book review. Something different. And if you're new, thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing. I don't do a lot of other book reviews, but if you'd like to learn about plants or homesteading or crochet or running or nursing or any of the other random things I've talked about since 2006, click subscribe. There's some links below if you'd like to follow the channel further. Follow us on Instagram. If you want to become a member, there's all sorts of things in the description, in the comments, all of it. So thanks for hanging with me, guys. That was a lot. I feel like I need to watch something very happy now, or do some plant care, because my plants are looking a little thirsty and plants make me happy. So I think I'm going to do that now. But thanks for spending the time with me, and until next time, take care, guys.